Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Hello again, and welcome back to my 70s TV childhood. It's great to have you with us, whether you're a regular listener or whether you're listening for the first time. This is the podcast which remembers what it was like to grow up as a child in 1970s Britain and takes pleasure in recalling the central part that television played in our childhoods and in British society at that time. There wasn't much to choose from with only 3 channels, but I think it was even more memorable just because of that. As always, thank you for your comments on the podcast. I am really so grateful for those of you who take the time to let me know what you like or even what you don't like about previous episodes. And even appreciate those of you who put me right about things I may not have remembered entirely correctly. The truth is, it was all quite a long time ago, so some misremembering is highly likely. Be great if you could get in touch, and you can do so by visiting www.my70stvchildhood.com, visiting our Facebook page at My 70s TV Childhood. You can tweet at 70s TV Childhood, or you can email me directly, Oliver at my70stvchildhood.com. Now, this episode is going to look at the old conundrum of whether life imitates art or whether it's vice versa. And before you leap to conclusions, we're not talking about the Mike Yarwood show here, rather the recurring episodic regular drama, or what we know more simply as the soap opera. Now, today's schedules are crammed with soaps. They feature in all the newspapers. They're a constant source of material for breakfast TV, and there are even lots of magazines dedicated to bringing you the latest news from your favourite soaps. We've got the big, long-running shows like Coronation Street and EastEnders. Okay. But we also have all sorts of others, like BBC One's Doctors, which brings us the daily dramas, lives and loves of a suburban doctor's surgery, and Channel 4's Hollyoaks, where an unbelievably glamorous cast of characters live through all kinds of exciting events in Chester. Now, I know Chester quite well, and without wishing to be rude to the people of that wonderful city, I've never seen quite so many beautiful people as are featured on the TV show. I think as well there's not also quite as many murders, drug deals, human trafficking gangs and all-round adventures in Chester either. But then I suppose that's not much drama. And if the story lines revolved around going out to the pub in Chester city centre, having a few pints and then a kebab on the way home, which is my normal activity on a night out in Chester, then Hollyoaks might be heading towards cancellation. And then there's Emmerdale, or Emmerdale Farm as it was known in the 1970s. Now, I live in rural North Yorkshire and can honestly say that Emmerdale is a good representation of what goes on around here. Well, once again, without the murders, robberies, the hot, steamy affairs, and the sorts of things where everybody discovers that their parents are not really their parents and their brothers aren't really their brothers and so on. Well, okay, perhaps it's not that good a representation. It's certainly come a long way from being focused on the struggles of Annie Sugden and her sons running a quiet farm in a small village, where most of the drama appeared to revolve around cows giving birth or Amos and Mr. Wilkes arguing with Seth Armstrong over whether he could have credit in the pub. And then, of course, there's the Aussie soaps like Home and Away and the soon-to-be axed Neighbours. But let's not stray too far away from home for this episode. As regular listeners might remember, I grew up in a town called Warrington in the northwest of England. And coincidentally, the UK's longest running and most successful TV soap opera was set not that far away. Coronation Street is now a national institution. It's been on air since 1960 and has stood the test of time when other shows have withered away. It's set in the fictional town of Weatherfield, which is based on Salford, and it was originally designed to portray working class life and its everyday dramas in a gritty, realistic way. I suppose it was building on the social realism of books, plays and films of the late 50s and then on into the early 60s, like Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. The programme's creator, Tony Warren, had to fight really hard to even get the show made, as it was considered by some that a northern drama might be incomprehensible to those watching down south who might not understand what characters were saying. Honestly, that's the truth. It was also originally due to be called Florizel Street, but according to one version of the story, the tea lady at Granada told Warren that Florizel sounded like a brand of disinfectant, so he'd better change the name. And Coronation Street it was. So on 9th of December 1960, the show was finally broadcast as part of an initial run of 13 episodes. It wasn't an instant hit, but after only a couple of months, word of mouth had made it the number one programme in the UK TV ratings, and, as they say, the rest is history. My parents were early watchers of Coronation Street in the 60s, and its impact on them and many others was enormous. It was the first time that ordinary northern people were the stars of the show, and by dealing with subjects which reflected the problems and the joys which ordinary people faced every day, it quickly became a firm favourite. It also provided the first of what were to become many dramatic moments which got the whole country talking about the programme. One feature of the show was the large number of strong female characters, which was a deliberate move by Tony Warren, who had himself grown up in Salford, surrounded by strong women. The likes of the fiery Elsie Tanner and landlady Annie Walker were just two of those strong women. But the most famous trio at the start of the series were the older ladies, Ena Sharples, Minnie Caldwell and Martha Longhurst. They would gossip about the other characters in the street and hold forth on their opinions on just about everything in the snug of the Rovers Return pub. But then, on 13th of May 1964, Martha Longhurst came into the Rovers and retreated to the snug with a bottle of milk stout, and promptly died, making her the first TV soap set-piece death, and one which rocked the nation. My parents said they were both absolutely shocked by seeing this episode, as it was completely unexpected, and that in subsequent days and weeks it was a constant subject of conversation across the country. How different to today's soap plot lines, when I imagine actors nervously read every new script to make sure their dramatic demise isn't hiding somewhere on page 48. Now, I don't remember when I first watched Coronation Street. It was one of those things which was always there. As a small child, I was obviously in bed when it was on, so didn't watch it until that magic time when you're, 5, 6, 7, that you're allowed to stay up and watch television. Firstly, during the holidays, then sometimes at weekends, and then eventually on school nights. What I remember most are the various characters first and then the plot lines second. From an early age, I got to recognise my favourites. At the top of the list were Hilda and Stan Ogden. Hilda, played by the great Jean Alexander, was the archetypal hard, working-class northern woman. She generally appeared with her hair in curlers under a hairnet and wearing a pinny, as she went around her various jobs as a cleaning lady. Hilda was a gossip, a busybody, and her acerbic tongue sometimes got her into trouble. But she had a sensitive side as well, and above all, she wanted to have nice things and make a comfortable home for her family. But unfortunately, fate always seemed to intervene, often in the shape of her husband, Stan, played by Bernard Ewins. Stan, if you remember, was a rather work-shy window cleaner who would much rather sit around reading the paper and getting some selections for the bookies than clean windows. But the two of them made a fantastic TV couple, forever arguing and falling out, but clearly devoted to each other. A couple of their storylines stand out from my childhood. On one occasion, I remember Hilda's luck seemed to have turned when she won a competition at the local supermarket. The prize was a 2-minute dash around the aisles filling up a shopping trolley with as much as she and Stan could fit in. They had their picture taken for the Weatherfield Gazette, and off they went. Unfortunately, once they got their haul home, Hilda found out that Stan had filled the trolley with frozen food, and guess what? The Ogdens didn't have a freezer. So yet again, poor Hilda was disappointed, and most of the food ended up being wasted. The other plot line I remember particularly well was Hilda's desire for some classy decorations. She set herself on having what today's designers might call a feature wall, I believe, but Hilda referred to her special wallpaper as her mural. Stan and the Ogdens' lodger, Scouse binman Eddie Yates, managed to finally put up the wallpaper after lots of messing about, and, for the finishing touch, fixed up a trio of plaster ducks, which were much sought after by some in the 1970s. Unfortunately, one of the ducks would not hang properly, and for the next decade, viewers would gaze upon Hilda's mural with its crooked duck, which in itself became a national treasure. Was Hilda typical of Northwest women of the time? Probably not, but she and the hairnet-wearing and quite fearsome Ena Sharplesand did represent what was an older generation that had worked hard and, frankly, had a hard life. As a small child, there were women in the terraced streets around where we lived who did wear curlers under a headscarf and what used to be called a housecoat as they swept their steps and kept house. There were also lots of older ladies, often widows, who formed a large part of the congregation in my father's parish in Warrington. They had all, like Ena and Hilda, worked hard through their lives and were fiercely proud of their homes, their families, and their community. I saw lots of these ladies in church on a Sunday, but also got to know them better at parish social events, all of which included, at some point in the afternoon or the evening, games of dominoes and whist as part of the entertainment. Now that may sound a bit tame, but I can honestly say that I've rarely seen more seriously competitive behaviour than that displayed by the ladies around a whist table at the parish social. As a small child, I was initially tolerated and allowed a bit of licence as I was learning how to play. But once I'd mastered the art of playing, and I have to say became reasonably good at the game, there was no quarter given, not even for the rector's 8-year-old son. I remember on one occasion, a lady whose sight was starting to fail mistook hearts for diamonds and committed the ultimate sin in whist by trumping her partner's ace. The ensuing silence, accompanied by a very hard stare from her partner, was a bit like a scene from a spaghetti western, and when the game was over, some very strong words were exchanged, some of which my 8-year-old self didn't understand. Once some of these ladies were sat around the card table, the smiles and the chatter stopped, and competition was deadly serious. One thing these evenings almost always ended with was lots of singing, generally round a piano. Lots of old music hall songs, patriotic numbers from the war, and it seemed to me as a child that all the ladies loved the entertainment. I think that's why the likes of Ena Sharplesand and Hilda Ogdenand struck a chord with me. None of the ladies I knew were like either of them, thank goodness, but the characters that Tony Warren created had traits which were recognisable in the doughty ladies in my father's parish. If Stan and Hilda were national treasures, there was much debate about the introduction of some new characters in the mid-70s. Jack and Vera Duckworth were introduced, together with Ivy Tilsley, mother of the legendary R. Bryan, who went on to marry the teenage Gail Potter, before leading her a merry dance with his endless womanising. Come to think of it, Gail hasn't had the best of track records with men. By my reckoning, she's had 5 husbands, including a psychopathic serial killer, a man who accidentally killed himself whilst trying to commit insurance fraud, and a bloke she met who was breaking into a house. Now, Gail, love, whatever you do, I suggest you probably don't get married again, because it's not a very good track record, is it? Anyway, I digress. And not for the first time, many regular listeners are saying. But Jack and Vera did cause quite a stir on their arrival in the street. They were crude, brash, and always at each other's throats. And there were several complaints to ITV at the time that they were lowering the tone of the show by their behaviour. As it was, they very quickly became two of the best-liked characters in the show. And I think that it was the fact they represented another type of northern working-class couple, a generation on from that represented by the Ogdens. Other notable characters from my childhood included Eddie Yates, as mentioned already, the Scouse binman and petty criminal with a heart of gold. Rita Littlewood, who combined running a newsagents with being a glamorous nightclub singer. Mike Baldwin, the Cockney entrepreneur, factory owner, and all-round ladies' man, who is still actually the only person I've ever heard regularly talking about London as the smoke. And of course there was Ken Barlow. I think there always was Ken Barlow, and I think there always will be Ken Barlow. Ken lived with his grumpy old uncle, Albert Tatlock, next door to the Rose Return pub, who, if you actually look very carefully on the programme, at the inside and outdoor shots, the gents' toilets of the Rose Return should have been in Uncle Albert's front room if the logic of the outdoor shots rang true. Or perhaps I'm overanalyzing that. We also had a couple of Jack the Lad builders, Len Fairclough, who married Rita, the newsagent cum nightclub singer I've just mentioned, and Ray Langton, who married Deirdre, whose main distinguishing characteristic was her enormous pair of glasses. Come to think of it, she wasn't very lucky with men either, being dumped by Ray Langton, marrying Ken, having an affair with Mike Baldwin, divorcing Ken after one of Ken's many affairs that happened through the years, marrying a Moroccan waiter she met on holiday who was then subsequently murdered, before taking it with a fantasist who pretended to be an airline pilot and then implicated her in a mortgage fraud which ended up with her in prison. No, not much luck for Deirdre at all. Anyway, I could go on, but I hear you say, please don't. I haven't mentioned much about Bet Lynch or Betty Turpin, never mind the legendary Elsie Tanner, who I most remember as a child being knocked down by a car in the street and lying motionless with a trickle of blood coming from her mouth as the credits rolled. A real cliffhanger episode ending. I don't remember much in the way of storylines from that time either, but one that I do remember vividly is the exit of Ernie Bishop. Ernie was the incredibly dull husband of Emily Bishop. And overall, Ernie was, well, how can I be kind, a bit of a loser from what I remember, having once owned his own camera business, which went under. And by 1978, he'd ended up running the payroll at Mike Baldwin's clothing factory, and, given that most people still paid in cash in those days, became the target for a bungled armed robbery. In dramatic scenes, Ernie was shot in the stomach on primetime TV and died, causing yet another national outcry about sensational storylines and the whole issue of violence on television. Looking back from today, where violent and untimely death is a real occupational hazard for a soap character, it all seems very tame. But I do remember seeing headlines in the newspaper for some time afterwards. Later, it transpired that the actor who played Ernie, Stephen Hancock, had had a falling out with the producers of the show, and from that moment on, his card had been marked. So, was Coronation Street an accurate representation of northern working class life in the 1970s? Well, of course it wasn't. That would have been very dull viewing. But what I think it did bring were some of the characteristics of my part of the world. The hard-working, tough-as-old-boots ladies with a heart of gold, the work-shy, feckless husbands, and, something I haven't mentioned so far, there was a lot of humour in the scripts, as well as melodrama. All in all, I think Tony Warren's genius set up the show to be what it has become, the longest-running TV soap in history. So enough of the Northwest. It wasn't the only part of the country to have a long-running soap opera with a local flavour. We also had a show which showed us that the West Midlands could provide just as much drama as Weatherfield, although often the walls were a little bit flimsier. The Crossroads Motel opened its doors in 1964 and was originally broadcast 5 days a week. It was normally broadcast as live, i.e. only one take was allowed in order to save money on the production. This inevitably led to fluffed lines, set and prop malfunctions, and the show quickly gained a reputation as providing unintentionally hilarious moments. So much so that the IBA, which ran ITV at the time, ordered that it only be shown 4 times a week in an attempt to improve the quality. I first remember the show as being on straight after the children's programmes on ITV finished, but I think that different ITV regions used to run the show at different times, so that may not be a similar memory for all of you. The most memorable feature for me as a young child was the music, written by the prolific Tony Hatch, who we all knew at that point from the New Faces talent show, and the credits, which came on from different sides of the screen, presumably cleverly designed to indicate a crossroad. Very clever. Having watched it for the music, I then started to get some understanding of the plots. It appeared to centre around a very scary lady called Meg Richardson, played by the legendary Noelle Gordon, who owned the motel, and the goings-on with her family and various staff members. Her son Sandy was a wheelchair user and was played by Roger Tong, who had become paraplegic himself, and thus he became an early disabled leading character on British TV. There were also a range of haughty staff like the smoothie Adam Chance and his on-off girlfriend Jill, who happened to be Meg's daughter. I think eventually they got married. There was also a cast of more lowly staff at the motel, who provided a bit of comic relief, with characters like Amy Turtle, the kitchen maid, and of course, the most famous of them, Benny Hawkins, the kind-hearted but rather dim handyman, who had a touching friendship with Miss Diane and provoked 1,000 schoolboy impressions and ensured that the woolly hat did not become a fashion item. Paul Henry, the actor who played Benny, became himself a national treasure, but probably didn't get that much more acting work given how strongly he became associated with the character. The show was also immortalised in Victoria Wood's Acorn Antique sketches, which played on the wobbly walls, the stilted dialogue, and the unusual closing scene where the cliffhanging ending was held almost in slow motion while the credits rolled and then resumed for a final word or some dramatic movement. So why didn't Crossroads survive like Coronation Street? Well, for a time it was extremely popular and gained audiences of 10 million or more regularly, but I think the scriptwriters ran out of steam, and there were only so many storylines which you could get from a motel, and audiences began to tail off in the 1980s, and despite a relaunch as Crossroads King Oak, the show was cancelled in 1988. Both Crossroads and Coronation Street were shown on ITV. But why, you may ask, didn't the BBC have any blockbusting soaps? Well, the simple answer is that the powers that be at the BBC felt that soap operas were not the sorts of programmes which fitted their brief under the Royal Charter. This was proved by the controversy and debate when the BBC announced that finally they were going to start their own soap in 1985. I mean, hard as it may be to credit now, there was lots of opposition to EastEnders before it began, as it wasn't the sort of thing BBC viewers would tend to want to watch. Well, it was an instant hit, attracting huge audiences from day one. So that just shows you how wrong the naysayers were. So going back to the question we started with, does life imitate art? Well, possibly. But the art of the soap opera has always taken its basis from real life, and I think that's why audiences love them so much. They can see themselves in some of the characters, doing similar things to the main protagonists, although most of us do draw the line at murder, blackmail and other heavy-duty crime. But what they do is they put everyday people into extraordinary circumstances and provide us with something priceless. A bit of an escape from our everyday lives. Do you have happy memories of Coronation Street? Or perhaps you loved Crossroads? Let me know by sharing your memories at www.my70stvchildhood.com. You can visit our Facebook page at My 70s TV Childhood, tweet at 70s TV Childhood, or you can email me, oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Well, that's all for now. Thanks again for listening. Take care, and hope to see you again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.